During the Third Reich, there were criminals who did not limit themselves to following orders. They made sadism their profession, transformed medicine into torture, architecture into an instrument of extermination, and bureaucracy into a genocide machine. While the regime's leaders occupied the headlines, a network of doctors, scientists, guards, and bureaucrats executed the most atrocious crimes with precision, coldness, and in many cases, enthusiasm. Some collected human skin, others experimented on living children, and many reveled in absolute power without limits or consequences. Who were these anonymous executioners? What kinds of perversions were committed and silenced after the fall of the Reich? When cruelty ruled, the perverse logic of the Third Reich. When one speaks of the Nazi regime, images of extreme violence appear as indisputable historical facts. However, there is a deeper and more disturbing question. How did a modern nation with scientists, doctors, and bureaucrats trained at Europe's finest universities transform sadism into institutionalized policy? The Third Reich not only tolerated extreme cruelty, but incorporated it as a structural element of its operation. The evolution toward this systematized perversion began after the First World War, when wounded nationalism sought scapegoats for its humiliation. In that fertile ground arose an ideology that not only identified enemies, but completely dehumanized them. The creation of the concept of the Untermensch, the subhuman, became the cornerstone of this transformation. For the National Socialist ideologues, Jews, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and later Slavic peoples were not simply political or ethnic adversaries. They were biological threats to Aryan survival. This ideology, meticulously propagated by Goebbels through school textbooks, newspapers, radio, and film, made it possible to erase all empathy toward these groups. Within the educational system, this dehumanization reached alarming levels. German children learned to distinguish Aryan skulls from those classified as inferior. Schools taught that compassion for these groups was a weakness, a betrayal of the race. The ideological perversion began in childhood. For the SS, the training went even further. Officers were specifically instructed to detach morality from their actions. Cruelty was not only accepted, but encouraged as an expression of loyalty. Within this distorted logic, torturing, sterilizing, or executing members of inferior groups was not a crime but a patriotic, even sanitary act. The SS soldier was trained to view prisoners as objects, as if his actions were purely technical rather than moral. This psychological reconditioning crystallized into an organizational culture in which sadistic acts were rewarded. A concentration camp commander who eliminated more prisoners than expected or who innovated more efficient execution methods received commendations, promotions, and privileges. The grotesque was dressed in technocracy. The inhuman became routine. Conventional professions underwent a macabre transformation. A doctor could advance his scientific career through vivisections on still conscious prisoners. An architect could design barracks calculating deliberately how many would die of hypothermia. An engineer could refine gas chambers to kill more people using fewer resources. A perverse chain of incentives was thus established. Violence ceased to be a means and became an end. Many perpetrators did not merely follow orders, they found satisfaction in their power over life and death. Guards who kicked prisoners to death, doctors who removed organs without anesthesia, officers who selected children for freezing experiments. Sadism was no longer an anomaly but expected behavior. The Nuremberg trials revealed this psychological machinery. In survivors' testimonies and the defendants' own defenses, a clear pattern emerged: moral disconnection. Franz Stangel's declaration is revealing. He, commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps, stated, "I felt nothing. It was a technical matter. I became accustomed." That coldness, that conversion of murder into procedure, represents the essence of institutionalized perversion. The physical evidence was equally chilling. The Allies discovered everyday objects made from human remains: lampshades of skin, book bindings of human leather, shrunken heads kept as trophies. The line between executioner and sadist had vanished completely. Most disturbing of all is that this machinery did not depend on obvious psychopaths. It relied on normal people, professionals, parents, individuals who outside that system would have led ordinary lives. The system transformed them gradually, normalizing the unimaginable through a progression of small moral abdications. First, theoretical dehumanization, then social isolation of the victims, next privileges for brutality, and finally the conversion of horror into routine. Nazi sadism was not accidental. It was systemic, structural, fostered. It did not arise from the madness of a few, but from the moral corruption of an entire power structure that found in cruelty not only a means, but a form of self-affirmation. The anatomy of this perversion reveals the fissures in the human soul when it surrenders completely to ideology, to absolute power, and to contempt for the other. This is the real monster that emerged in the 20th century. Not only the individuals who perpetrated crimes, but a state, cultural, and educational apparatus that made sadism a virtue. A machine that transformed ordinary people into executioners. An ideology that did not merely kill bodies, but perverted consciences. Surgeons of pain, science in service of Nazi horror. The history of the Third Reich is riddled with infamous names, but lurking in the shadows are figures equally sinister who used the scalpel as a tool of torture. They were not merely soldiers following orders, but men and women with scientific training who turned medicine into executioner. This is the story of those who betrayed the Hippocratic oath to serve Nazi ideology. Before the outbreak of war, eugenics already enjoyed academic backing in several countries. However, in Germany, this pseudo-scientific current transcended theoretical debate to become state policy. Alfred Plötz and Ernst Rudin provided the theoretical framework that would later justify forced sterilization and eventually the extermination of those considered genetic ballast for German society. The Action T-Vir program, driven by doctors such as Karl Brandt, constituted the first step towards systematic murder. Under the euphemism of euthanasia, more than 70 million persons with physical and mental disabilities were eliminated. Physicians falsified death certificates, inventing natural causes for deaths caused by lethal injections or experimental gas chambers. This program laid the technical and psychological groundwork for the subsequent Holocaust. Among these professors of horror stands the little-known figure of Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician and president of the German Red Cross. At the Ravensbrück concentration camp, Gebhardt oversaw atrocious experiments intended to simulate war wounds for testing sulfonamide treatments. The victims, primarily Polish women, were deliberately infected with bacteria such as Clostridium perfringens. Shards of wood, glass, and soil were inserted into open wounds, or bones were broken to study regeneration under extreme conditions. Gebhardt did not act alone. By his side worked Fritz Fischer, a doctor who actively participated in these mutilations. Fischer was responsible for selecting the victims and documenting the procedures with cold scientific precision. After the war, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, but his sentence was commuted and he was released in 1954. He lived quietly until 2003, showing no remorse for his actions. Herta Oberhäuser represents a particularly disturbing case. As the only woman tried in the doctor's trial, Oberhäuser worked at Ravensbrück performing vivisections without anesthesia, extracting muscles and bones and injecting chemical substances into open wounds. Her specialty was draining and removing parts of vital organs while the victims remained conscious. One of the most striking testimonies against Oberhäuser came from Jadwiga Dzido, a Polish survivor who showed her mutilated legs to the Nuremberg tribunal. Dzido described how Oberhäuser had infected her wounds with bacteria and subsequently removed muscle and nerve tissue to document the effects. Recovery was long and painful, leaving her with permanent disability. Despite having been sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, Oberhäuser served only 5. After her release, she resumed her medical practice in West Germany until one of her former victims recognized her, leading to the revocation of her license. She died in 1978 without ever having expressed remorse. Nazi medical horror was not confined to adults. Children and twins were of particular interest to these researchers. Although Josef Mengele is the best known, others such as Sigmund Rascher carried out equally atrocious experiments. In Dachau, Rascher studied the effects of altitude and freezing. To do so, he subjected prisoners to low-pressure chambers until they suffered cerebral embolisms or immersed them in tanks of icy water to document the process of hypothermia. One of the most disturbing aspects of this dark chapter was the complicity of academic institutions. German universities and hospitals not only endorsed these experiments, but received biological materials, brains, skeletons, organs, taken from camp victims. Decades after the war, some of these institutions continued to use anatomical preparations of criminal origin in their laboratories. Most of these atrocities came to light during the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, 1946 to 1947. That proceeding not only punished perpetrators, but also established the Nuremberg Code, a cornerstone of modern medical ethics requiring informed consent for any human experimentation. Nevertheless, many of those convicted received relatively lenient sentences, and several escaped justice entirely. The case of these Nazi doctors raises unsettling questions about the relationship between science and ethics. How could professionals trained to heal become executioners? The answer seems to lie in the deadly combination of totalitarian ideology, dehumanization of the other, and personal ambition unrestrained by moral limits. The story of these professors of horror serves as an enduring reminder. Knowledge without ethics can become the most dangerous weapon. The white coat, universal symbol of healing, was stained with innocent blood in the name of a science perverted by hatred. Their most important legacy is not their findings, which had little or no real scientific value, but the perpetual warning about the dangers of decoupling knowledge from humanity. Women without mercy, the gods who sowed panic. The historical narrative of the Holocaust has tended to focus its attention on male perpetrators. However, from the shadows of the concentration camps emerged female figures whose cruelty proved equally chilling. These women were not mere bystanders. They actively participated in torture and extermination, sometimes displaying a sadism that surprised even their male colleagues. The Nazi camp system employed more than 3,500 women as auxiliary guards, recruited primarily to oversee female prisoners. Although they could not be official SS members, they received similar indoctrination and wielded almost unlimited authority over the inmates. These Aufseherinnen, female supervisors, came predominantly from working-class backgrounds and were drawn by wages higher than those available in factories or domestic service. Among these figures stands the little-known case of Alfreda Rinkel, born in Leipzig in 1922. Her story is particularly disturbing not only for her crimes but for her success in evading justice. Rinkel worked as a guard at Ravensbrück, the largest exclusively female concentration camp, where more than 130,000 women and girls were interned and at least 50,000 perished. Survivors remembered Rinkel for her German shepherd, specially trained to attack prisoners. She would unleash the dog on women weakened by starvation and watched with satisfaction as they were bitten and torn. According to testimony, she seemed to take particular pleasure when her victims screamed or begged for mercy. The most astonishing aspect of her case is what happened after the war. Rinkel managed to emigrate to the United States in 1959 and married Fred William Rinkel, a German Jew who had escaped the Holocaust. For half a century, she lived quietly in San Francisco, even participating in charitable work for Jewish organizations. Her husband never learned of her past, and it was only in 2004 that US authorities discovered her true identity. She was deported to Germany in 2006 but never stood trial. She died in 2018 at the age of 96, having never faced real justice for her crimes. Maria Mandl, an Austrian born in 1912, represents another level of institutionalized perversion. She began as a simple guard, but her efficiency and cruelty earned her promotions until she became Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Third Reich's deadliest extermination camp. It is estimated that Mandl was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 500,000 women. Her nickname, the Beast, was not given lightly. Mandl actively took part in the selections upon train arrivals, deciding with a simple gesture who would live temporarily as a forced laborer and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. Witnesses recounted how she particularly enjoyed separating mothers from their children, personally ordering the children's deaths while forcing the mothers to work, fully aware of their fate. One of the most disturbing expressions of her sadism was the creation of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra. A lover of classical music, Mandl selected prisoners with musical talents and forced them to play while other women marched off to work. or to their deaths. This macabre contrast between Schubert or Mozart melodies and the surrounding horror reflected the aesthetic perversion of the Nazi regime. Mandel also developed a system of pets, or favorites, selecting Jewish women who temporarily received better treatment until she tired of them and ordered their execution. This behavior reflected not only cruelty, but a perverse desire to toy with her victims' hopes. Unlike Rinkel, Mandel did not escape justice. She was captured by American troops in 1945, tried in Krakow, and executed in 1948. During her trial, numerous survivors testified about her brutality, although she insisted to the end that she was only following orders. Less well-known but equally sinister was Hildegard Neumann, who served at the Theresienstadt ghetto camp. Propaganda presented it as a model settlement, but in reality it functioned as a transit center to Auschwitz. Of the 140,000 people who passed through Theresienstadt, more than 33,000 died there, and approximately 90,000 were deported to their deaths. As a supervisor, Neumann had the authority to decide who remained in the ghetto and who was sent to Auschwitz. Witnesses described her as methodically cruel, selecting children and the elderly in particular for deportation. Unlike other guards who displayed emotion, anger, overt sadism, or pleasure, Neumann acted with administrative coldness, preparing deportation lists with the same indifference one might use for any bureaucratic record. Neumann disappeared before the camp's liberation. For decades, her fate was a mystery until recent investigations suggest she lived under a false identity in West Germany, where she apparently started a family and worked in a government office until her death at 92 years old, never facing justice. The phenomenon of Nazi female guards challenges stereotypes about women's participation in atrocities. Far from showing greater empathy toward victims by virtue of their gender, many displayed extraordinary levels of cruelty. In the patriarchal Nazi context, some even competed with male colleagues to demonstrate greater toughness, thereby securing their positions in the camp hierarchy. The majority of the guards were never tried. Of the thousands who served in the camp system, only a few dozen faced tribunals, and fewer still received significant sentences. Post-war society, with its own gender biases, tended to view them as less culpable than their male counterparts or as mere followers of orders. The female face of Nazi horror reminds us that the capacity for extreme cruelty knows no gender. When ideology and power combine with the dehumanization of the other, even those from groups traditionally associated with care and nurturing can become efficient perpetrators of unimaginable atrocities. Genocide on paper, the desks that killed millions. The Nazi death machinery would never have achieved its terrifying efficiency without the planners who, from offices and desks, designed every cog of the extermination process. These genocide bureaucrats never got their hands bloody, yet were responsible for millions of deaths through orders, memoranda, and meticulously crafted logistical plans. The Reich Main Security Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, created by Heinrich Himmler in 1939, served as the administrative brain of repression and extermination. It was not merely another agency, but a bureaucratic monster with tentacles reaching from internal surveillance to coordination of the concentration camps. Divided into 7 departments, or Ämter, this structure administered death with corporate-level efficiency. After Reinhard Heydrich's assassination in 1942, a lesser-known name assumed command of this vast apparatus, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Born in Austria in 1903, this lawyer-turned-fanatic was physically intimidating, his facial scar accentuating his menace. Yet what proved truly terrifying was his administrative coldness. As head of the RSHA from January of 1943, Kaltenbrunner oversaw the Gestapo, the Security Service, Sicherheitsdienst, the Criminal Police, Kripo, and the Mobile Killing Units, Einsatzgruppen. Documents bearing his signature ordered mass deportations to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. He received daily reports detailing execution figures, gas chamber performance, and mortality rates in each camp. Nothing escaped bureaucratic record-keeping. Bullets used, poison gas consumed, even the number of gold teeth extracted from corpses. Death itself became a statistic to be optimized. At his Nuremberg trial defense, Kaltenbrunner claimed ignorance of atrocity details. Evidence proved otherwise. He had personally visited Mauthausen and witnessed gas chamber executions. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and executed in October of 1946. Less known but equally lethal was Alois Brunner, Adolf Eichmann's principal collaborator and one of the Third Reich's foremost deportation experts. Born in Austria in 1912, Brunner coordinated the deportation of at least 130,000 Jews from Austria, Greece, France, and Slovakia to the extermination camps. Brunner's effectiveness lay in his meticulous attention to detail. He organized transports with railway precision, exact timetables, optimized routes, fully calculated loads. To him, deportation was a logistical operation no different from shipping freight, save for the cargo, human beings destined for death. In France, he ran the Drancy transit camp, the antechamber to Auschwitz for thousands of French Jews. There, he did not merely oversee deportations, but personally took part in torture and humiliation. Witnesses recounted how he tore beards from elderly rabbis and deliberately separated families to compound their psychological suffering. Her most devastating work took place in Greece. Between March and August of 1943, Brunner organized the deportation of 48,000 Sephardic Jews from Thessaloniki, a community with more than 2,000 years of history. In barely 5 months, he annihilated a millennia-old legacy of Judeo-Spanish culture in the Balkans. Brunner was also a pioneer in the use of gas vans, vehicles modified so that victims were killed by carbon monoxide during transport. This innovation allowed the extermination to reach regions lacking camp infrastructure, especially in Eastern Europe. Unlike Kaltenbrunner, Brunner escaped justice. With the help of the rat lines, Nazi escape routes, he fled to Syria, where he lived under the protection of Hafez al-Assad's regime for decades. Mossad attempted to capture him on 2 occasions by sending letter bombs that cost him an eye and several fingers, but he survived. He is believed to have died in Damascus around 2001, never having faced trial. Nazi genocide was above all an industrial-scale logistical operation. It required train synchronization, material supplies, personnel management, and agency coordination. The RSHA conducted this macabre orchestra, ensuring that each component functioned in concert. An illustrative example of this mindset was the timetable conferences, meetings where representatives from the Reichsbahn, German railways, and the RSHA coordinated victim transports to the camps. They discussed topics such as the optimal number of people per car, the most efficient routes or applicable fares. Victims paid their own way to death with reduced rates for children, just like any other rail service. Another crucial element was meticulous documentation. For these bureaucrats, paperwork was sacred. Every victim was registered, every transport documented, every gram of dental gold accounted for. Orders always followed official channels, with copies sent to the relevant departments. This archival obsession would later provide crucial evidence at the post-war trials. The language used by these architects of genocide reveals their ability to distance themselves morally from their actions. They never spoke of killings, but of special treatment, evacuation, or resettlement. Victims were units, pieces, or material. This linguistic dehumanization allowed them to treat death as a mere administrative transaction. The most disturbing aspect of Kaltenbrunner's, Brunner's, and the RSHA's roles is precisely this fusion of bureaucracy and barbarism. They transformed mass murder into an administrative process, complete with departments, budgets, and performance evaluations. Horror became office routine, with officials signing deportation orders and then returning home calmly to dinner with their families. The Holocaust was made possible not only by hatred and violence, but by bureaucratic efficiency, by men who, from offices lit by desk lamps and surrounded by maps and filing cabinets, methodically organized the greatest crime in history. Their legacy reminds us that the most devastating evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears a suit, signs memoranda, and files its crimes alphabetically. Death troop, military officers who turned war into massacre. Among the sinister figures of the Third Reich, the military commanders who oversaw massive massacres are often overshadowed by notorious leaders such as Hitler, Himmler, or Göring. However, without these field officers who turned genocidal ideology into concrete action, the Nazi death machine would never have achieved its devastating efficiency. In occupied Poland in particular, these officers with a license to kill demonstrated that the line between soldier and executioner could vanish entirely. Wilhelm Krüger emerges as one of these lesser-known but fundamental figures in implementing Nazi terror. Born in Strasbourg in 1894, Krüger built a solid military career before joining the Nazi Party. In 1939, he was appointed Höherer SS und Polizeiführer, higher SS and police leader of the General Government of Poland, a position that made him the highest security authority in the occupied Polish territories. Under Heinrich Himmler's direct command, Krüger coordinated the systematic repression of any Polish, Jewish, or communist resistance. He implemented the doctrine of collective responsibility, whereby entire communities paid for individual acts of resistance. For every German soldier killed in ambushes, Krüger ordered the execution of between 50 and 100 Polish civilians chosen at random. Whole villages were razed in reprisal for partisan activities, their inhabitants either massacred or deported to concentration camps. Krüger's terror system operated with military precision. The so-called AB actions, Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, Extraordinary Pacification Operation, led to the arrest and execution of more than 30,000 Polish intellectuals, teachers, priests, and community leaders during 1940. The goal was not only to eliminate active resistance, but to culturally decapitate the Polish nation, destroying its identity and capacity for self-government. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Krüger's administration was the forced Germanization program for Polish children. Thousands of minors deemed racially Aryan were kidnapped from their families and sent to Germany to be raised as Germans. Their names were changed, the Polish language forbidden, and Nazi ideology indoctrinated fanatically. This silent crime sought to erase entire generations by stealing not only lives but whole identities. While Krüger managed the terror apparatus from above, units such as the SS Totenkopf division carried out atrocities on the ground. This division, whose symbol was a skull, was initially formed from concentration camp guards. It was not a conventional military unit, but a terror instrument designed to cleanse territories by exterminating undesirable populations. During the Poland campaign and later the invasion of the Soviet Union, Totenkopf operated as a mobile killing force. Its members not only fought conventional battles, they specialized in mass executions, deportations, and collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads that followed the regular army. Totenkopf's brutality reached unimaginable levels in the east. In Ukraine and Belarus, they took part in operations such as Barbarossa, where entire villages were massacred under suspicion of supporting partisans. In several hamlets, the division executed all adult men and deported women and children, following a systematic pattern of ethnic cleansing disguised as anti-partisan operations. Unlike regular Wehrmacht units, which sometimes hesitated at extreme orders, Totenkopf distinguished itself by its enthusiasm for carrying out atrocities. Testimonies collected by Soviet and Allied commissions after the war describe macabre competitions among its members to prove who could kill most efficiently. A captured, non-commissioned officer confessed that his unit awarded special leave to those who showed particular effectiveness in cleansing operations. Theodor Eicke, founder of Totenkopf, had been the architect of the concentration camp system before the war. Under his leadership, the division incorporated terror methods first developed at Dachau and Sachsenhausen. Eicke personally instructed his men to treat racial enemies, especially Jews and Slavs, not as military adversaries but as biological threats that had to be eliminated without compassion. The relationship between Totenkopf and the Einsatzgruppen was particularly sinister. While the latter's explicit mission was the extermination of Jews and political commissars, the division provided logistical support, perimeter security during mass executions, and additional personnel when the killing squads proved insufficient. This collaboration completely erased the line between military operations and genocide. In Poland, the occupation model implemented by Krüger and carried out by units like Totenkopf set a precedent of brutality that would later expand across the rest of Eastern Europe. It was not merely about occupying territory, but about demographically reconfiguring it through mass deportations, forced resettlements, and direct extermination. Occupied Poland became a laboratory of social and racial engineering. Krüger oversaw the creation of ghettos in major cities, confining the Jewish population in conditions that guaranteed high mortality from starvation and disease. At the same time, entire regions were emptied of Poles to be repopulated with German settlers under the Heim ins Reich, Return to the Reich program. This conqueror-colonizer vision defined the mindset of Kruger and other Nazi military commanders. The East was not merely territory to be occupied militarily, but a space to be transformed racially and culturally. The plan called for the physical elimination of Jews, the reduction of the Slavic population to semi-enslaved labor, and the Germanization of the territory by settling racially appropriate colonists. Impunity was total. Kruger reported directly to Himmler, and the units under his command operated outside the constraints of international law or even traditional military conventions. This system of absolute power, combined with a fanatical racial ideology, created the conditions for ordinary men to become executioners. Most disturbingly, these military men were not ideological fanatics from the outset. Kruger had been an officer in the Imperial German Army. Many Totenkopf members came from humble backgrounds with no prior record of violence. It was the Nazi system, with its combination of racial indoctrination, rigid hierarchy, and rewards for brutality, that transformed soldiers into killers. As the war turned against Germany, the brutality intensified. In 1944, faced with the Soviet advance, Kruger was appointed security commander in Austria. There, he continued implementing terror policies, including summary executions of German deserters and civilians accused of defeatism. The logic of total destruction was applied to the very end. The war's end did not bring justice for these uniformed executioners' victims. Kruger committed suicide in May of 1945, avoiding trial. Many Totenkopf officers escaped via the rat lines, Nazi escape routes to South America and the Middle East. Others benefited from the Cold War, when Western allies prioritized recruiting anti-communist intelligence over pursuing war criminals. The legacy of these soldiers-turned-monsters reminds us that the line between military discipline and barbarism can be fragile. Without mechanisms of accountability, civilian oversight, and respect for international norms, any armed force can become an instrument of terror. The atrocities in Poland were not isolated excesses, but the predictable result of a system designed to dehumanize, persecute, and exterminate. Perverts of power, sex, torture, and pleasure in the Nazi camps. The Nazi concentration and extermination camps were not merely facilities to isolate, exploit, or eliminate groups deemed enemies of the Reich. Beneath their barbed wire architecture and watchtowers lay a system in which violence transcended its instrumental function to become an end in itself. A space where sadism was not only unpunished, but actively encouraged and, in many cases, rewarded with promotions and privileges. The structure of absolute power created the perfect conditions for the expression of the most perverse impulses. From the moment of arrival, prisoners were stripped of everything that constituted their identity: their clothes, belongings, hair, names. This systematic dehumanization, being reduced to a tattooed number, made it easier for perpetrators to perceive their victims not as human beings but as disposable objects. In that context of unlimited authority and total absence of consequences, behaviors that in any normal society would be deemed criminal or pathological flourished. What distinguished this system was that such conduct was not hidden but normalized within camp culture. One of the most disturbing aspects was the institutionalization of sexual abuse. Although Nazi ideology publicly exalted racial and moral purity, the reality in the camps was radically different. At Ravensbrück, a camp primarily for women, prisoners were systematically raped by guards and officers. Some were selected as temporary favorites of commanders, receiving slightly better conditions in exchange for submitting to constant abuse. Women who became pregnant as a result of these rapes faced a terrible fate. If discovered, they were typically sent to the gas chambers or subjected to forced abortions under conditions that often proved fatal. A few managed to conceal their condition thanks to solidarity from fellow prisoners, but babies born in the camps rarely survived due to malnutrition and horrendous hygiene. Men were not exempt from sexual violence. In camps such as Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, male prisoners were subjected to rape and sexual humiliation, especially homosexuals identified by the pink triangle. These assaults served as mechanisms of domination and entertainment for guards and kapos, prisoners in delegated positions of authority. In 1942, with Heinrich Himmler's direct approval, A system of brothels was established in several camps, purportedly to incentivize workers and privileged prisoners. Women selected from Ravensbrück were transferred to these establishments, where they had to serve dozens of clients each day. Far from receiving the promised improvements in conditions or possible release, these women were treated as sexual property, enduring constant abuse and contracting diseases that often proved fatal. The case of Ilse Koch, wife of Buchenwald Commandant Karl Otto Koch, represents one of the most notorious examples of sexualized sadism. Nicknamed the Witch of Buchenwald, Koch personally selected prisoners with interesting tattoos to be killed. According to numerous testimonies, she ordered that their skin be fashioned into lampshades, book bindings, and other decorative objects. Koch strolled through the camp half-naked, deliberately provoking starving, weakened prisoners, then brutally punishing anyone who dared look at her. This exhibitionism, combined with extreme cruelty, exemplified the fusion of power and perversion that characterized the system. After the war, she was sentenced to life imprisonment and committed suicide in prison in 1967. Violence in the camps often took on aspects of spectacle. At Mauthausen, guards organized fights between prisoners weakened by hunger, betting on the outcome. In the camp quarry, prisoners were forced to carry heavy rocks up the so-called death staircase, 186 irregular steep steps, while guards timed their performance and punished the slowest. At Auschwitz, SS officers used prisoners as moving targets for shooting practice. At Treblinka, survivors like Jankiel Wiernik testified that guards competed to see who could throw babies highest and then shoot them as though they were clay pigeons. These diversions were not exceptional, but part of the daily routine. Music played a particularly sinister role in ritualizing horror. Maria Mandl, chief supervisor at Auschwitz, created the camp's female orchestra, forcing musically trained prisoners to perform classical pieces while columns of doomed inmates marched to the gas chambers. This grotesque contrast between Schubert or Mozart melodies and industrialized death intensified the psychological trauma for both musicians and victims. Perversion reached its most extreme expression in the literal objectification of the human body. Beyond using hair for mattress stuffing or body fat to make soap, officers such as Christian Wirth at Belzec or Jürgen Stroop in Warsaw collected human body parts as trophies, skulls turned into paperweights, skin made into gloves, and tattoos framed as artwork. Buchenwald's Dr. Erich Wagner compiled a collection of tattooed human skin that eventually numbered more than 40 specimens, catalogued and displayed as though they were botanical or zoological examples. He even wrote an academic treatise on tattoos, using this research material, illustrating the ultimate perversion of turning human suffering into a pseudo-scientific study object. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings documented these horrors through survivor testimonies, perpetrator confessions, and physical evidence. However, the full extent of sexual perversion and sadism in the camps has never been completely understood. For decades, these aspects were marginalized in Holocaust historiography, both from academic reticence and out of respect for the victims. Only recently have studies of sexual violence in genocide contexts recognized these dimensions as structural rather than incidental components of the camp system. Sadism was not an individual deviation, but an integral part of the terror apparatus, a mechanism to dehumanize both victims and perpetrators. The most disturbing lesson of this historical chapter is how, under certain conditions, human behavior can degrade to unimaginable levels. The Nazi system did not have to recruit obvious psychopaths. It transformed ordinary people into sadists through a precise combination of dehumanizing ideology, absolute authority, and guaranteed impunity. This lesson may be the most unsettling takeaway from Nazi sadism. The capacity for extreme cruelty is not exclusive to obvious monsters, but a latent possibility that emerges when certain social, moral, and legal controls vanish. What happened in the camps was not merely abstract evil, but the systematic outcome of structures specifically designed to foster humanity's worst impulses. Broken justice, the trials, the escapes, and the silence of the guilty. With Germany's capitulation in May of 1945, the Nazi terror machine ground to a halt. But a new chapter was just beginning, the pursuit of those responsible for unprecedented mass crimes. While some perpetrators faced tribunals and convictions, thousands more managed to evade justice, vanishing into the cracks of history or forging new identities in distant lands. World War II had ended, but the quest for accountability had only just begun. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1949, represented the first attempt to apply international justice to war criminals. The International Military Tribunal initially prosecuted 22 Nazi leaders, including prominent figures such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop. 11 were sentenced to death, 7 received various prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. These proceedings established crucial legal precedents, introducing concepts like crimes against humanity and rejecting the defense of following orders as justification for atrocities. However, Nuremberg merely scratched the surface of the problem. The Third Reich had involved hundreds of thousands of people in its criminal apparatus. What happened to the rest? The case of Ernst Kaltenbrunner illustrates the fate of those who could not escape. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, Kaltenbrunner had signed countless orders for deportation and extermination. Captured by American forces in May of 1945, he was tried at Nuremberg, where he faced overwhelming evidence, including survivor testimonies and documents bearing his signature ordering mass executions. During the trial, Kaltenbrunner adopted the typical defense strategy. He denied direct knowledge of the crimes, arguing that his subordinates acted without his explicit approval. This defense collapsed under proof that he had personally visited camps like Mauthausen and witnessed gas chamber executions. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and executed in October of 1946. Yet for every Kaltenbrunner who faced justice, dozens escaped. The most notorious flight was that of Adolf Eichmann, the Holocaust's chief logistical architect. After the war, Eichmann briefly hid in Germany before escaping to Argentina in 1950 with a Red Cross-issued passport. For a decade, he lived as Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires, working for Mercedes-Benz and maintaining a seemingly ordinary life. His capture by Mossad agents in 1960 shocked the world. Eichmann was clandestinely transported to Israel to stand trial for genocide. The sessions were televised internationally, allowing millions to witness both the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust and the harrowing testimonies of survivors. His execution in 1962 marked a rare moment of justice in the post-war era. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, had a different fate. Responsible for atrocious experiments on twins, dwarfs, and other prisoners, Mengele escaped to Argentina in 1949, then moved to Paraguay and finally to Brazil. For 3 decades he lived as a fugitive, protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers and using false identities. Despite being one of the most wanted war criminals, with multi-million-dollar rewards offered by various governments, Mengele was never captured. He drowned while swimming at a Brazilian beach in 1979. His remains were exhumed and positively identified through forensic tests in 1985, closing one of the most frustrating chapters in the post-Holocaust pursuit of justice. The massive escapes would not have been possible without the Reitlines, clandestine networks that facilitated the evasion of Nazi criminals to countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Syria. These routes involved various facilitators, former SS officers, certain elements within the Catholic Church, Latin American governments sympathetic to fascism, and surprisingly, Western intelligence services interested in recruiting anti-communist agents for the Cold War. The case of Alois Brunner exemplifies the impunity many achieved. Directly responsible for deporting at least 130,000 Jews to extermination camps, Brunner fled to Syria, where he lived under the protection of Hafez al-Assad's regime for decades. He changed his name to Georg Fischer and worked as an advisor to Syrian intelligence services, sharing interrogation and repression techniques. Although identified and condemned in absentia by France, Brunner was never extradited. He survived 2 Mossad assassination attempts, letter bombs that cost him an eye and several fingers, but remained at large. He is believed to have died in Damascus around 2001 at the age of 89, never having faced a tribunal for his crimes. The case of Alfreda Rinkel represents another disturbing variant: criminals who fully integrated into democratic societies. A guard at Ravensbrück known for unleashing dogs on prisoners, Rinkel emigrated to the United States in 1959 and married Fred William Rinkel, a German Jew who had escaped the Holocaust. For nearly 5 decades, Rinkel lived quietly in San Francisco, hiding her past even from her husband. Only in 2004, after his death, did US authorities uncover her true identity. She was deported to Germany in 2006, but due to her advanced age, 84 years old, and the difficulty of gathering evidence after so long, she was never prosecuted. She died in 2018 at the age of 96. The phenomenon of respectable neighbors with bloody pasts proved surprisingly common. John Demjanjuk, identified as a guard at Sobibor and Treblinka, lived for decades as an auto mechanic in Cleveland before being unmasked. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, worked for US intelligence before fleeing to Bolivia, where he advised dictatorial regimes on torture techniques. Hermine Braunsteiner, the stallion of Majdanek, known for crushing babies with her boots, was discovered living as a housewife in Queens, New York. Beginning in the 1970s, organizations dedicated to hunting Nazis intensified efforts to locate fugitives. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, under its namesake survivor's leadership, and the tireless work of couples like Beta and Sergei Klarsfeld, managed to identify hundreds of hidden criminals. However, in many cases, time worked against justice. Witnesses died, evidence deteriorated, and perpetrators grew old. In recent decades, Germany has stepped up judicial pursuit of Nazi criminals, even those with seemingly minor roles. John Demjanjuk's trial in 2011 set a precedent by establishing that anyone who served in an extermination camp, regardless of specific duties, shared responsibility for genocide. This principle enabled the prosecution of former guards like Oskar Gröning, the Auschwitz bookkeeper, and Ivan Kalimon, even when they were over 90 years old. Post-Holocaust justice remains incomplete. For every perpetrator tried, dozens escaped. For every Eichmann executed, hundreds lived comfortably into old age. Yet ongoing efforts to identify and prosecute criminals, even decades later, send a crucial message. There is no statute of limitations for crimes against humanity. Although justice may be late and imperfect, memory and truth remain tools against impunity. Studying these divergent fates, trial or flight, reminds us that justice is not automatic. It requires political will, international cooperation, and above all, resistance against forgetting. The final lesson of this dark chapter is that vigilance against extremism and commitment to human rights must be constant, for the difference between justice and impunity often depends not only on the magnitude of the crimes, but on the persistence of those who seek truth and accountability.